It took me 40 years to realize that I was an introvert. I like people, some people, not everyone, but I like most people. But being around people, socializing, especially face-to-face, is absolutely exhausting for me. If I have to lead a meeting, even if it's online, but especially if that meeting is in person, I need to just lay down and recuperate for an hour afterwards. It takes a lot of my energy. And conferences are really the worst for me because there's so much social activity. Even if you're sitting in a seat and watching a conference presenter, there's still this feeling of being in a social environment. So I can't spend 12 hours a day doing that sort of thing. I need that space in my life where I'm just alone and I have a chance to kind of collect myself and to reorient my thinking and then go back out into those social situations. And it's really funny because it took me almost my entire life to figure that out. As a kid, if you looked at it objectively, I was kind of the classic introvert. I would bury myself in books. I had one or maybe two really, really, really close friends, but everyone else was kind of at arm's distance or they were just an acquaintance. And my brother, of course, was the opposite. My brother, he would make friends anywhere he went. If he was just going shopping at the mall, he would make a friend. He would make friends sitting at the train station. We have great stories about that. And I grew up thinking that my personality was extroverted when in fact it was actually introverted. And one of the reasons was because I have a certain amount of charisma. So when I do go out into social situations, it's easy for me to kind of connect with people. It's easy for me to understand and to empathize and to see where people are coming from. So engaging with people, especially one-on-one, was never really a problem for me. Even in small groups, I could navigate it for a certain amount of time and in a certain way. But large groups, especially large groups of strangers, always made me feel uncomfortable and really kind of hyper aware in some sense. So even with all of this history, all of this past experience, I never realized that I was an introvert. And I got a lot of reinforcement from people around me that I was actually an extrovert. They would always talk about how social I am or how easy I am to get along with because they only really ever saw my social side. They never saw the introverted side. The introverted side was sitting at home reading books and not just spending that time out with other people. They only really saw situations where I knew I could navigate the social environment well, that I knew I could navigate it without too much trouble. And I just completely avoided any kind of situations I felt that I found difficult or uncomfortable. So I would rarely, if ever, go to a party. Even when and especially when I was invited, I would tend to say, thanks, it's really great that you invited me to that party. I don't think I'm going to be able to make it. And it was often because I knew that there would be people that I didn't know at that party, and there might be a big group of them. And so I just tried to avoid it just to kind of, because I knew that situation wasn't going to make me comfortable. And I really had no kind of reference point of how to act. There was I didn't have a playbook of this is how you socialize in these settings. And still, after all of that, I didn't realize that I was an introvert. And I went and studied in college and I learned how to perform music. And there's a specific protocol when it comes to performance and even public performance like public speaking. You have kind of a script. You know what you're going to go up there and do, and you know how you're going to do it. You know when you're going to do it. And it's the same way with teaching. You have kind of a mental script for how you're going to approach this piece of work. And it's also being on stage or being in front of a group of people. It's a lonely experience in a certain sense. You're alone up there. Even if you're working in a cast of a play or a musical or anything like that, you're still there's still a centeredness where you have yourself as kind of this entity. It doesn't have that same feeling that you would have of community when you're at a party or you're in a group of people and you're having to have dialogue with everyone. It's a much more lonely experience, and I think a lot of people realize. So it's around that time I started realizing I was an introvert, and I would go out and in my first, in the early days of my teaching career, I would teach hundreds of students, and I would go to conferences and present for hundreds of people, and immediately after class or immediately after my conference presentation, I would escape. I would just run away. I couldn't get out of the room fast enough. And everybody would be kind of left going, but where did Anthony go? Like I wanted to ask him a question, or I wanted to get some insight. And so I started to connect the dots at that point. I started looking at my behavior in the present day, and I started looking at my past, and I started realizing that my needs for socialization are different than how people perceived me. So people perceived me as an extrovert. They perceived me as needing a lot of social interaction, when in fact I needed very little social interaction, and I needed social interaction kind of on my terms. And I always need that feeling of isolation afterwards in order to replenish and recuperate myself. So the takeaway here is, if you identify as an extrovert, that's awesome. Good for you. But if you're unsure, imagine what your ideal vacation would be. This is one of the realizations that I made as I started imagining my ideal vacation. And every time I started imagining it, it was me by myself. And so as much as I love the people in my life and I would want to go on vacation with them, there's also a certain sense of comfort that comes with being alone. So maybe that will help direct you. Maybe that will help you realize, like me, that even though people see you as an extrovert, that you're actually an introvert.